Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and Kimberbell Designs has done it again. They have created a fun, whimsical, bright, happy wall hanging, and the embellishments are really great. As always, the fabric is fun and playful. It has some beautiful, bright colors in it. And the quilt is called Red, White, and Bloom. It's a 40-inch square quilt, which means it's very achievable. This book not only has the pattern, but it has 3 other projects in it. It has a tote bag, a little table topper, and some really cute little dishcloths. We have the fun appliques, some yo-yos, and the fun part to go with all of this are the little embellishments. We have fun buttons and ribbon, wool balls that will make cherries, ribbon that gets pulled, and when we pull it together, it makes beautiful flowers. All of these fun things that we're going to be able to stitch on top of the quilt, and 2 sets of these twinkly little lights. This will really add a lot of fun and a lot of dimension to the wall hanging. So I'm going to make a small version. I'm going to take some patterns from this book and some of these embellishments. I'll be using the ribbon, the wool balls to make the cherries, and I definitely want to find a way of bringing in these little twinkle lights. The quilt has different size blocks that go together to make the quilt, which means we can use individual blocks for our own patterns and design our own quilt from them. We do have all of the templates and all the embroidery pictures in the back. So I'm going to start with my Home Sweet Home, put in some pop bottles and see what I come up with. I will be making 3 of these pop bottles, and in this design they have this pinwheel coming out of them. But I'm going to have flowers and ribbon come out of it. The bottle is stitched with this vinyl, and that gives it that glass look. And this does come with that set. So the first thing we need to do is get our fabric and trace out that pop bottle. I'm going to cut my fabric 5 inches by 10 inches. And I'm going to use the 3 fabrics that have this light print that have words on them. So I've traced out the shape of the bottle with a disappearing marker. If we're making the pop bottle, we're going to take a really tight zigzag and stitch that straw line first. But I'm going to be putting a flower in here, so I'm just going to stitch a wiggly line that would look like the stem of a flower. So that's the first row of stitching I'm going to do. So I have my little stem, and I know it's hard for you to see, but I do have my pop bottle shape. I'm going to be able to put this vinyl over top, and I'm going to be able to stitch right on that line. We can use a straight stitch, or you can use a triple stitch. I would recommend putting a little bit of a stabilizer on the back, and if you have a Teflon foot, this is a great time to use it, because we want that foot to run smoothly over top of that vinyl. If you don't have a Teflon foot, try to put some tape over the bottom of that foot, and that's going to help it slide. Nothing special. You're going to be able to stitch right through this vinyl and go all the way around and then do that little shadow on the bottle. I just have a regular foot on my sewing machine to sew this vinyl, but I do have a stabilizer along the back, and any stabilizer will work. I will be using a triple stitch, which means I'm going to go forward 2 and then back 1, forward 2 and back 1. And that's going to give that heavier stitch along the side. And you can see how easy this is just to sew with just a regular foot. You can always test a corner before you start. And that's all there is for sewing on top of that vinyl. Now I can take a pair of scissors and cut all the way around the outside of that stitching. With that plastic cut out along the sides, it does give that bottle Well, a bottle look. And I'm going to make 3 of these pop bottles with a random stem coming out of the end because I will be putting a flower on the end. This package has 3 different ribbons in it. We have a white, a red, and the teal. We're going to be able to make 2 flowers out of each of these strips. So we're going to take that, fold it in half, and cut between one of those flowers. Along the top, you're going to notice a thread. We want to pull that thread and it's going to gather all of this flower together. But we have to make sure that we hold both ends or put a knot in one end. And once the knot's done on the one side, take the free end and we're just going to pull this all the way through. If we do not have a knot at one end, we're going to pull that right out and we won't be able to gather them. So be sure to test that knot on the one end to make sure it stays. We can now take that knot and just knot those 2 ends together. Do a couple of knots just to secure that down. You're going to have one long thread and hold on to that because we're going to use it to stitch the flower down. Once that flower's been gathered, we are going to be able to stitch it to the top of that pop bottle, but we're going to do that after the top is put together. So be sure to leave that string on. And if you want more than one flower coming out of the pop bottle, stitch 2 stems. The next little portion I want to add in is this Home Sweet Home. This could be hand embroidered, or you can get the file to machine embroider this. I traced out that shape and I did that triple stitch, and very carefully I slowly went all the way around these shapes. If I want now, I can fill in this area here or just leave it. So I have my Home Sweet Home and 3 bottles. I'm going to square this up and then add a piece on the top and the bottom to equal the size of my bottles. I did make these larger so that I could put some flowers on the top. So I'm going to make this piece the same as this one. I have my pop bottles on that end. I'll add a strip on this end because in the pattern there are these really cute yo-yo cherries. And I'm just going to take the yo-yos and put them along the side. I want to add a border all the way around. I'm going to cut the border at 2.5 inches. So it looks really simple right now, but when we start to embellish it, it's really going to come to life. But we do need to quilt this next and embellish it after the quilting is done. So I'm going to quilt this and I'm going to show you some of the embellishments, and I'm going to show you a special technique to use those little twinkly lights with. I did a very simple all over design, but I did not quilt over top of these bottles. I will need to trim this and put the binding on first, but the binding's going to be done a little bit different because that's where those little twinkle lights are going to come in. Normally, after we've trimmed this, we put the binding on the front and we roll it over to the back to do the hand stitching. Well, we're going to put the binding on the back and bring it to the front. And that might give you a good idea on where we're going to put those twinkle lights. So let me get that binding on. So that binding is on the back, and I'm going to hand stitch it to the front. As I'm hand stitching, I'm going to stitch in this wire. About every 4 inches, we do have one of these little light bulbs. And I'm going to want one of those little light bulbs to stick out. So I'm going to hand stitch that wire underneath, and then when I come to a light, I'm just going to let that light come out. There is one little thing we need to do to get this to go in the back, and we're going to need to take out about 2 stitches. We're going to feed that wire through the back where we released those 2 little stitches. So that little end will poke in and come out. So we can have all of that come out, and that's going to leave that little control panel along the back. And we'll make a little pocket for this later. Put some clips to hold them in place and just turn that binding over and stitch that wire in with that little bulb sticking out. Once that binding's done, you can barely see them, but once you put them on, you really can see how cute they are. Those little lights have 2 wires and a little light in between those wires. So what I did is I stitched that binding down so that I didn't touch the wires on that inside, and then did a little stitch here, little stitch on this side, and 1 or 2 little stitches in the center. And that was to prevent that little light bulb from falling back into the binding. So the only 2 places I stitched over top were on each side of that little light. All the other wires are buried in the binding. Once those little lights are on, we get to finish embellishing. On the back, I made a little pocket for those controllers. And the pocket is right over this little area where I took out those 2 stitches. So the wires have gone through this side and out through that side. So there's a tiny little hole in the bottom of my pocket to accommodate those wires. So make a pocket that fits your controllers and just hand stitch that on. Now the fun part, where I get to embellish all of this. The flowers I can stitch on top of those stems, and I can make little bows to go somewhere on the pop bottles. And because I have that thread, I can use that thread to stitch them on. Or I can stitch them on by putting one of those cute little buttons in the center. The Home Sweet Home, we had some cherries. We have 2 felted wool balls. We need to take this decorative thread, put it through the center of the wool balls. A sharp tapestry needle, anywhere between a 16 and an 18 will work. Put that thread in and just go right through the center of that ball. Tie a knot on the end and just tighten that up and trim that little fray off. And do the second one. I now have those little cherries done. If you did an applique leaf, you'll be able to put it there, or you can do this dimensional leaf. And that dimensional leaf would be stitched on now. So to make a yo-yo, we do need that circle. I'm going to be using dark thread so you can see it, but a matching thread is preferred. I use a double strand, tie a knot, and now we're going to do a basting stitch all the way around the circle, but we will turn that little corner over. And we're going to be able to just do this as we go around. So we're just rolling that edge down and stitching it down with a basting stitch. When all that stitching's done, we're just going to pull those threads and it's going to gather that all up and straighten that out. Once we have that shape that we want, I use that thread and I stick it into the center and pull that needle out from the back. Make sure that yo-yo's the shape as you want. Give it a little pull. And in the back, make a knot. And with this thread, I'm going to be able to stitch this down. I added a lot of different embellishments that came with that embellishment kit, and I just had some fun and put them in different places. Buttons on top of the yo-yos, buttons underneath. I added more flowers. And the really fun part about this wall hanging is something you only see if you do one thing. You cannot see those little twinkle lights all the way around unless you look really, really close. But it is such a fun way of finishing off the quilt. This was definitely a lot of fun to make. I used a lot of the things that were in the pattern. I just rearranged them a little bit so that I could get a small wall hanging, and using those twinkle lights, it definitely makes this fun. This is a new pattern from Kimber Bell called Red, White, and Bloom. And I'll put a link in the description so you can check out the pattern and the new fabric line. And as always, thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe and come on back. Let's see what we're making next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.